Sponsored by Squarespace.
You know that last year I started a Warhammer 40k army older than I am. I got super excited and started buying miniatures left and right to collect one of each of these crazy, unique Rogue Trader Orc models. I did manage, but then came the big move. We moved to this new home, and also a Thunderhawk kind of showed up. And many other small and bigger projects during the last year. And the orcs have not been forgotten, but they were pushed aside for a little bit. So what's the plan, Emil? What are you gonna do about it? Well, I'm gonna tell you a story about someone. This is the Great Gargant from Armorcast. It may not look much for the untrained eye, maybe more like a turtle's toy than anything, but for those of us who are in love with the quirkiness of the Rogue Trader and 2nd edition era, this is the #1 we need to get. It all started in the early 90s. As a 40k player, you had pretty much no option when it came to vehicles. There were two, and both of them were for the Space Marines. But two guys were out to change that. The sculptor Mike Biasi and the editor-caster Tim Dupuerti. Mike the sculptor got a copyright license to produce 40k scale models of the epic vehicles, which means the super tiny ones that you had in the game Epic.
Or as it was called back then, Space Marine. Epic battles in the Age of Heresy.
Word soon got around about these wonderful models, and Tim had an idea. An idea to port some of the rules from Warhammer Epic to 40k, so he started publishing Inquisitor magazine in June of 1991, with rules for these models. This is pretty much exactly around the time when 2nd edition Warhammer was released. On top of having this magazine, on the side Tim also made conversion kits of the Rhino and sold with the permission from Games Workshop. And as mentioned, this was all the way back in 1991. This was way before Games Workshop was the giant corporation they are today, much more lenient with licenses and letting other third-party brands make miniatures for their game. And in 95, when they had been at it for about 4 years, Tim formed the company Armorcast. They got a license for 3 years to create vehicles, titans, and the large monsters in a time when Games Workshop didn't have any of this and didn't cast anything in resin. One of the last sculpts that Tim released that Mike sculpted was the Great Gargant. Obviously, like many other sculpts that Mike did, it derives from the Epic counterpart. And at the end of 98, it was time for Armorcast to renew that license. But Games Workshop had other plans. They saw how popular these resin cast miniatures were and realized there was a big market for it. They decided not to let them renew the contract, and a year later, Forge World was born, as Games Workshop's own brand to create large vehicles and bigger monsters. Armorcast, however, is still around. After the split with Games Workshop, they started focusing on making buildings and terrain for wargames. And I managed to get hold of Jin Fritter, who's been the owner of Armorcast since 2007. And when talking to Jin,
he told me that 313 models totally were made, and 6 out of those were sent directly to Games Workshop as per the license contract.
And much of that is due to the size, the complexity of casting, and of course, the price.
And if you're ever in Ohio, the local gaming store Warzone Matrix actually have one at display in the store for those lucky enough to visit.
Most of the other Armorcast vehicles and designs were made in a much larger quantity, but with the license ending, this one never really had a chance to make it big. Not physically, of course, because it's huge, but you get it. And if you like the style of this one, there was a brand called Epicast. Very similar to what Armorcast did, they produced 2 bigger orc tanks, vehicles, titans, whatever you want to call it, the Gork Stomper and the Mork Stomper. And speaking of Gork Stompers and Mork Stompers, you know what? I like to stomp up my artwork on my website. And that website is made with Squarespace. Squarespace is a super simple platform to use where you can make your own website to promote yourself, your brand, or maybe just show your artworks and hobby that you do. One of my favorite features is the gallery. It's so easy to make a gallery. You just press gallery on the website, you just drag an image and drop it, and your gallery is good to go. So if you have this great idea of a company you want to start, or maybe just do art and show other people, you can check out Squarespace by following the link down below, and if you use the code Squidmar to get 10% off, you get 10% off. But now let's get back to talk about these beautiful orc models. So here we are, 25 years later. This old retro orc army needs a centerpiece. Because all of these old models are tiny by today's standard, and we need something big to capture the eye. So how can one find a miniature that wasn't sold in Europe and was produced in pretty much non-existent amount of copies? Well, you don't. But fortunately, there's a huge community for retro 40k space orcs. And Gilbert666 have made an inspired 3D printable Gargant. It is only about 2/3 of the original Gargant size, and there are quite a bit of adjustments to make it look a bit different. But it really does capture that retro goofiness of the old orcs, and honestly, it's lovely what we can do with the technology we have today. I'm using the Frozen Mega 8K printer to print out all of the big parts, and using my smaller Frozen printers for the tinier bits. I feel like I finally found like the perfect purpose to have one of these big resin printers. This is it. Like, you can get a heavily inspired copy of this miniature in resin, printed in your home. How awesome is that? And comparing that with like the FDM printers that most people would print something big like this in, the quality difference is enormous. So in one of these artworks that Paul Bonner did for the Rogue Trader books, he painted them in what looks like a city in the desert, like an oasis city, and there is this like old bazaar, and it just looks very sort of like deserty. And on top of that old Paul Bonner artwork, we have this legendary GORKAMORKA piece that's set in sort of like a Mad Maxian desert. So that's the feel that I really want to capture for my orcs. Like maybe have some of these like desert plants and maybe some palms or something, so it does feel like there's a little bit of growth there, but mainly like desert feel. And I really want to capture it for this one as well, but since I don't have any base, I'm gonna have to do some planning around that and maybe make it dusty with pigments and stuff. But let's just start painting it and then we'll see wherever it goes from there. Let's do it. And this is where I remind the 50% of you that aren't already subscribed to get a grip of your life and just smash the subscribe button so you don't miss out on the awesome videos we release every week. And after the first few base coats, I make sure to seal everything with the varnish. And normally I never use varnish on a miniature, but it's gonna be super easy to rub off paint when I'm playing with it because it's a 3D printed figure. And this was the first time I had a chance to try out Army Painter's new airbrush line, and during this short test period I actually enjoyed it. And for the reds I'm using Games Workshop Wilrider Red. And all of the metal colors we use are from the Vallejo metal color line. The base coats are Gunmetal Gray and the Copper. And with a little bit of help from Lucas and Victor in the end, I finally got all of the base coats done. After another layer of varnish starts the fun part. We're gonna go all in with the enamel-based Streaky Grime. You can add this either with the brush or the airbrush, but it's just a lot simpler to get it out fast with the airbrush. It's gonna help bring all of the different layers together and help cement it in a real environment. And if you're copying this paint job, just slap it on the entire miniature. If you're doing it through the airbrush, make sure to protect yourself. You don't want enamel paints in your lungs. Now begins the magic step. I'm using cotton pads dipped in white spirits in a stippling motion. This removes any of the streaking grime I don't want on the miniature, but anywhere I want it, like in the cracks and crevices and on all of the nuts and bolts, we get the feeling that it's been out in the environment for a long time with oil residue, dust and dirt collections in the cracks.
And because we're using a cotton pad and not a paper tissue, we get these tiny cotton fibers left behind, similar to maybe worm-like patterns, but they're super tiny, so it leaves a really cool effect on the miniature. And when it's had a time to dry, it's time to add chipping and highlights. For the chipping, I'm using a tiny sponge and dip it in Rhinox hide and just place it on select places. We don't want to go overboard since we already have a lot of weathering from the Streaky Grime. I couldn't shake the feeling that the red wasn't as vibrant as I had hoped. So I carefully went over most of the red parts with some P3 red ink. I also used the Vallejo metal color silver, spray that from above on the metal areas to get some of that metallic sheen back. Just a quick spray from above is all you need. And all the glowing green is made in 3 different steps. Start with the airbrush and spray some white ink, and it's totally fine if we get some leakage on the sides of what's gonna glow. We're then gonna go over it with Warpstone Glow, the contrast paint. Some of the areas I could just leave the center of it white, on others I had to go back with white ink in the center, like on the eyes. The final step is to take the Vallejo Flourescent Green. I spray this in 1 or 2 coats depending on the area. And with that we got some amazing glowing areas. Another quick thing you can add that really makes a huge difference for the overall feel is a muzzle burn to all of the bigger guns. I start off with an orange ink and go about halfway down the barrel. To finish it off, we're just gonna use some violet or purple ink and spray that in the front. It's really that simple. Then going in and adding some micro scratches all over. On the reds I'm using a mix of Lugganath orange and Wilrider Red. I'm also adding some metallic NMM sheens on the miniature. It's really to make it look more like my style, because I often have this over-the-top metallic sheen feel to my miniature. For the whites, I'm using Ivory. Don't forget to highlight the nuts and bolts to give the miniature more volume. And as a final detail, I'm adding some weathering pigments. I'm mainly using dark yellow ochre, but also a bit of rust. Adding this mainly to the bottom of the miniature, but also some of the areas where dust would be collecting. Well, my ladies and gentlemen, it's finally time for a grand reveal. Oh my god, it's so huge compared to the old orcs. Massive thanks to everyone who donates a few dollars over at Patreon. Without you guys, I would not be able to make these videos every month. If you want to help out, we got the link to Patreon down in the video description. Down there and on the website squidmar.com, we try to list all of the tools we use when we make these videos. So if there's something you want to pick up, we got affiliate links down below. That's another great way of helping us out.
So the orc army is finally on the way. I love how this is looking. And if you want to check out Squarespace, remember to follow the link down below.